I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. For the ones of you that don't know me, I'm Uli Dangle. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Our speaker today is Alan Organschi. He's his research interests are very closely aligned with mine, and he's so therefore he's not just a great colleague, but also a great friend to me. And we're so glad we can have him here to speak to us today. This is kind of the second lecture in the series that is sponsored by the Softwood Lumber Board, generously supported by the Softwood Lumber Board. The last lecture was the one Susan Jones gave a couple of weeks ago. So we're very pleased that the Softwood Lumber Board is supporting us, and Alan can be here with us today. So Alan Organschi is a principal and partner at Gray Organschi Architecture, which is an architectural practice in New Haven, Connecticut, which is recognized internationally for its integration of design, construction, and environmental research. Alan is also the founder of the material experimentation and fabrication firm JIG Design Build, which in 2018 created the Ecological Living Module, a fully self-sustaining microhouse for the United Nations Environment Program. And then probably most significantly recently, Alan was appointed as the Director of Innovation Labs at the Bauhaus Earth, which is based in Berlin, Germany. And Bauhaus Earth is a global interdisciplinary initiative with the goal to transform the building sector from a major source of anthropogenic environmental and social impact into a regenerative and ecologically sensitive means to meet the housing and infrastructural needs of an urbanizing global population. And in this capacity, he directs the development of a network of international labs, its experimental projects, public programs, and transsectoral collaborations with global partners. All the while, Alan also continues as a senior member of the faculty at the Yale School of Architecture, where he's taught advanced design studios and building technology for over 2 decades. In that capacity, he also continues to collaborate with faculty and researchers at the Yale School of the Environment, and specifically the Forest School, by conducting interdisciplinary seminars and symposia in forest management and environmental design. His ongoing research project, the Timber City Initiative, and I'll put the link to that in the chat just after I'm done here, examines the application of emerging structural wood fiber technologies to the construction of global cities. And Timber City has been awarded grants from the Heinz Fund for Advanced Sustainable Research in Architecture, the US Forest Service Wood Innovation Grant Program, and Sitra Finland Innovation Fund for Circular Economy. Alan has written and lectured extensively on the carbon storage potential of biogenic material substitution in urban building and the transition to circular economic construction materials and methods. He is a co-author of the upcoming book, and I'm really excited about this forthcoming publication. The book is titled Carbon, a Field Manual for Building Designers. And he also, in January 2020, published a scientific paper in the Journal of Nature Sustainability with the title Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink. In that same year, this paper received the Aquila Capital Transformation Award for scientific research contributing to the decarbonization of Europe. So in addition to his architectural work also being featured in numerous publications, his architectural practice was recognized by the Architectural League of New York as an emerging voice in architecture and has also received several ARA awards. And in 2012, Alan and his partner Elizabeth Gray were honored for their work with an Arts and Letters Award in Architecture by the American Academy of the Arts and Letters. Lastly, because he's not busy enough, Alan also currently serves as the industry advisor to the US State Department Bureau of Overseas Building Operations as part of its Climate Security Roundtable. So with that, Alan, I want to warmly welcome you to the UT School of Architecture. I'm really looking forward to your lecture, and I also know that he always has stunning visuals in his presentations. Thank you, Alan, for being here today.
Thank you, Uli. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, David, everyone at UT. I'm sad not to be there in person. I apologize for that. The era of COVID has thrown us all, and hopefully we'll be back on track now that the sun is out and it's warming up. I'll share my slide. I'm hoping that everyone is seeing it. Today I want to talk about really about kind of a long circle that has brought me to this moment where I find myself living in New Haven, Connecticut, and in Berlin, Germany at the same time. And that work is as Uli mentioned, as director of this new lab network, global lab network called the Innovation Labs, at a new initiative founded on the 100th anniversary of the former Staatliches German Bauhaus that we all know, Walter Gropius's Bauhaus. But ours is called Bauhaus Earth. And I want to talk a little bit about why we feel that we can co-opt the name Bauhaus and what our goals are. And I want to do it through a kind of story of how I got there, if I could be a little narcissistic for the next 45 minutes. So that's my story today, a big circle that brings me from this first slide back to the goals that we hopefully all share societally. I love this picture. It's a picture of what's called a Studienreise, or a student trip for the architecture students of the Bauhaus. And what I like about it is that the Bauhaus is this sort of image of the modernity of the 20th century, the sort of inventiveness, new design ideas, responding to all kinds of new social, economic pressures to come up with a new aesthetic for the world. And yet these students are going to climb into a horse-drawn carriage and make a trip to look at buildings. And I think that tells us something about where we are at this particular moment. We don't know what kind of systems and technologies we will possibly be engaging to solve the huge challenges that we have in front of us. And we may be operating in a kind of metaphorical horse and carriage as we try to imagine the solutions that we can make to the most dire existential threats that humanity has truly ever faced. And it's important to remember also that the original Bauhaus was responding to a particular cataclysm of its own, the cataclysm of World War, which was actually taking place across a continent, engaging actors beyond those continental boundaries. But the idea was that suddenly a whole ruling class had failed the society in general. It created wars and massive destruction. And the Bauhaus was an idea about how to create a language of design and art and thinking, artisanry that reflected a new order, social order. And today we face our own cataclysm. It's maybe a little slower rolling than World War, but it is a kind of a war against a massive change in our climate, which has dire consequences. If you read the paper every day, the IPCC, International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, seems to come out with a new, more dire warning about the consequences of our changing climate. So as we look over this image of urbanized Tokyo, the largest megalopolitan organization on Earth, 37 million residents across a huge land area, greater metro Japan. The other thing to remember is that this is also the largest stockpile of human-made material in the world, a city. And so this brings us to a really big question about consumption and the role of consumption in producing climate change, emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions, extractivism of remote landscapes that we never even see when we consume materials. And that's really kind of the subject of what I'd like to talk about today. So thinking about Tokyo, and remembering that this landscape represents a kind of a future, that 2.3 billion people will be living in cities by 2050, which it would, if we continue to build with the levels of density that we do now, that's a 3 times the increase in land area, doubling the building stock, and 3 times the area of land that we'll consume, which represents a building footprint, not a city, but a building footprint that's 56,000 square miles, which is for the Northeasterners among you, that's about the size of the entire state of New York. It's for Europeans, it's 2 Irelands. For Texans, I think it's about a fifth, 20% of the land area of Texas. Imagine walking through the building corridors that are the size of 1/5 of Texas. This is really good news for the construction sector and for the things that we do if we're going to profit from it. That's $97 trillion worth of building, which is more than the current value of the entire built environment. But all this life cycle impact that is entailed in making that represents right now 40% of greenhouse gas emissions annually, which is a oft quoted estimate, but I think many of us working in this field think it's a vast underestimate. But more importantly, by the time we hit 2050, about half of those emissions will be associated with impacts created at the very beginning of the building life cycle, through the production stage, the extraction of material, transport, processing, et cetera. So that before we even get to make our super efficient buildings pay off our carbon debt, we've created an enormous carbon spike. And I'll talk about that a little more soon, which represents about 26 gigatons of emissions by 2050 in the building sector. There are very many numbers that you'll see. This is the one that we use. And what's more important is that we projected that were we to transform building from a mineral-based, largely fossil hydrocarbon economy, Texas, into a bio-based economy using the storage capacities of plant-based materials, we would be able to store about 36 gigatons rather than emit 26 gigatons, and thereby start to have a real role to play in the building sector as a regenerative force in building rather than an emitter. So really what I'm talking about today are two landscapes, the forest and the city. And these are massive systems, right? Land-based systems. The terrestrial forest sink is the largest land-based sink we have. It's slowly weakening, as you know, as you've seen pictures of California or Australian or Siberian forest fires. Disease is taking over. The city is growing fast. It continues to grow fast, as I said. And so really these two landscapes have been at war, or I should say one landscape, the city, has been a kind of predator of the other landscape, which is the forest. And if we look at the history of these buildings and we start to understand what it takes to build buildings of massive scale, we essentially have dug, literally and figuratively, ourselves into a giant hole. And then if you also start to look at that giant massive pile of material that is represented by most global cities, we see that we have just surpassed the point where anthropogenic mass, in other words, buildings, the stuff that we industrially produce, now outweighs all the biomass on Earth. And so what we're looking at is an extractive set of economies that happen to exist globally that produce a sort of dead end for the recovery of the Earth. And this is a particularly egregious moment across the landscape, a copper mine in Utah. But the important thing to remember is that we are laying a kind of anthropogenic mat across the Earth's surface, and we need to start to deal with that. And the first place we can deal with it is in our own work and right at the beginning of the building life cycle. And this is a thing that I really feel pretty strongly about, and that is that architects and engineers and builders have enormous agency as consumers of enormous amounts of material through the buildings we specify to act against these changing climate conditions. And remember that first year is where we dump a lot of emissions into the air, and we create a lot of waste too, solid waste that's covering the Earth. So this is a little bit of a paradigm shift from the way we think about sustainability. We used to think about sustainability primarily as operational emission efficiency or operational efficiency, reducing energy consumption, building really fat, super insulated, super tight walls with lots of really good insulation materials that are made of fiberglass and foam, plastics, and things like that. And that was all very well and good, except what we found really over now several decades of pushing sustainability efforts, that we haven't solved anything. And largely that's because in the building sector, what happens is we create this carbon spike, as I mentioned, at the building life cycle, and then our emissions are relatively flat if we have super efficient buildings or net zero buildings, relatively flat during the operational lifespan of the building. And occasionally we have some renovations and repairs, and that pushes a little more carbon dioxide and its equivalents into the atmosphere. Then it flattens again. And at the end of the building life, we tear the building down, and mostly we landfill it. Sometimes we burn it for energy, parts of it. And that creates another spike. And so what you see is that we never, no matter how efficient we are in our building operations and how much insulation we pack in and how much renewable energy we use, we're always throwing more material and consuming more raw material to make our buildings operate better. So we looked at this idea of comparative emissions around primary structural materials. And what we found was that concrete and timber and steel have very different carbon footprints, of course, as you might guess, or you well know. And the problem is that when materials are typically compared, the metric is a unit weight per carbon emissions. And so that means that like a piece of concrete and a piece of wood by tonnage emit pretty close to the same amount, as you can see in that bar graph. If you take into account the massive increase in strength to weight ratio of a material like timber, you start to see that the strength to weight comparative emissions by weight is a ridiculous metric. And then if you add the capacity of these materials to actually store carbon, because biologically timber is half carbon, you start to see the real benefits of using plant-based materials. And these are significant if you think about that big carbon spike we're talking about. And it is very ironic to me that a relatively low-intensive method of removing materials and processing it produces perhaps the most destructive morphology that we know in terms of building and urban human settlement, which is suburbia, with huge infrastructural costs, constantly updating roadways and transmission lines, and et cetera, producing enormous vehicular traffic and associated emissions. Meanwhile, these really intensive, high-impact material classes, steel and concrete, which use enormous amounts of energy, even when efficient, produce actually quite efficient building morphology, urban building morphologies, dense, high-rise or mid-rise building. So the question is, how do you break the cycle between, or the relationships that exist between dense urban building, which really should be our future, given the population growth that we have and the land area that we have available to us, and these more extractive mineral-based economies? And then that same relationship that seems fundamental to the way we think of building, which is that timber is used for these very low structurally requiring morphologies, suburbia. And we think we do it through really trying to pull in our skirts a little bit and looking very carefully at the way that regeneratively or sustainably managed forests and other agricultural waste systems, et cetera, can be moved through this new material processing that we're going to talk a bit more about today into the city. And what's really important to remember about this idea of using biological materials renewably is that the carbon cycle relies not only on forests, but also on the woody matter and soils that exist below in the upper layers of the lithosphere, where 50% in our forest biome, 50% of the carbon that exists in the forest exists in the soils. So you can literally cut down some trees if you do it carefully with potentially really good benefits and still actually protect huge masses of carbon. And as the forest regrows, you get huge benefits. So we should talk quickly about the challenges that we face in thinking about using all this biological material for building cities. Biomass is, as you know, a CO2 source. As it rots because of a particular fungus, like brown rot fungus, it emits carbon on the forest floor. Currently, domestic and heating and cooking is fueled mostly in the world by wood, the burning of wood. But there are obviously other forces of forest conversion. Beef grazing land, land formerly rainforest converted to beef grazing land, say in Latin America, South America, is one source of amazing forest conversion. Of course, also agricultural conversions. This is an oil palm plantation in Borneo, and tar sands oil extraction in Alberta, Canada, as an example. And then, of course, suburbanization itself is consuming forest and creating emissions. And then climate change itself has a huge impact on forests, as we've seen in these catastrophic fires around the world. So that brought me and my colleagues at the Timber City Research Initiative, Andy Ruff, who Michelle Addington knows well, Andy and I and a bunch of people from Yale started working on this idea that you could start to study the forest growth and the systems of forest growth, this very succession of different classes of forest, the different kinds of materials that come out of that, the biodiversity that's created as you create these different forest stands, as you harvest regeneratively, looking at how you transfer that carbon through these different products into buildings, whether moderate size, low-rise buildings or larger, denser buildings. And you start to see in that line underneath the horizon line, this really important point that forests will continually, cyclically absorb and emit carbon dioxide. But if you can somehow salvage that material from the forest and use it in a productive way and store it in our most durable consumer products building, and especially big buildings, and now we have the technology to do that, and the building regulations that allow us to do that, you can store huge quantities of carbon. And in fact, it has been studied by a colleague of mine that a standing area of forest, of Amazonian rainforest, has less carbon stored in it than a urban district of the same dimension made of timber. So that's not to say we should be cutting down Amazonian rainforests, but that's just to let you know what the capacity of the work that we're going to do anyway to build for 2.3 billion people could be as a force for regenerative and as a force of climate reversal. So the idea is that can forests, obviously not a technological system, work through its sort of biospheric activities with our technospheric activities as builders to produce a kind of synergy and a geotechnological one. So that brings me to this guy, John Schellnhuber, a theoretical physicist who ran the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research for 30 years. And he is a self-described amateur, loves architecture, and he ended up on a team with me writing a paper called Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink with a Russian environmental scientist, a number of industrial ecologists, and political scientists. And we looked at this capacity of the built environment to reverse its impacts to the point that it's actually a beneficial carbon sink working in synergy with forests. And essentially, I'll go through this rather quickly, but essentially what we did was our team modeled different assemblies out of different materials. We actually designed them and engineered them for a generic kind of average apartment for unit and built into aggregated buildings of 7 stories across the planet's demand. And we pretty quickly were able to measure through this quantitative arithmetic process. We could actually measure how much greenhouse gas would be emitted by these different kinds of material classes and these different building typologies, and how much would be stored. But we were very careful to acknowledge that population growth will be happening in very different places, maybe remotely from forests. And so we looked at a sort of 10% scenario, which is how much of the population growth that's going to happen is going to take place in Europe, North America, Japan, and Oceania, where there are already burgeoning mass timber or biological structural material programs at work, industrial processes. And then we looked at a 50% scenario. We added in Asia primarily and South America, and that covers about 50% of anticipated population growth. And then we went to Africa, where another 40% of the next 30 years of demographic transformation is going to take place. And of course, there are very vulnerable forest biomes that exist in Africa as well. But we looked at that, and really what we found is that if we keep building the way we will, as I mentioned before, we're going to emit a lot of carbon. But if we could shift it to and take away that capacity of material production and consumption and shift it into biological systems, we'll have a huge political economic shift globally, but we would also potentially store and avoid emissions equaling almost 36 gigatons. So here we are globally, 36 gigatons of potential carbon storage and emissions, sorry, let me say this again. We have this is the human footprint on the Earth, right? Which we can use to store 36 gigatons of carbon that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere if we use this biomass scenario. And that's actually, it's a lot of carbon, but what is really important is that if we can do it right, this incentivizes 255 gigatons of potential carbon storage through the afforestation or forest restoration and expansion that can happen across the globe. And I'm not saying that this is what you get if you all agree to sign on to the bioeconomy. We're really just speaking about potential here. And this is a way to kind of maybe shift the way we work and think in building. So just a note, these are not existing forests. These are forests that could exist were we to afforest landscapes that are readily able to be forested. So this is a long shot, but we have a lot to make up for. I just take a few minutes to whip through some slides because I think I've been talking about these big picture items, and as Uli mentioned, I have an architectural practice, and actually I started as a cabinet maker and had middle class guilt and decided to go to graduate school. Some of you may have experienced that yourself. Anyway, I went to graduate school, incurring huge debt, and then went into business. And of course, our practice was always geared to making things, and particularly out of wood, because that was my, training originally. And then how wood can be manipulated and how it plays out in occupied spaces and how those wood systems relate to the land around it, and more distally to landscapes from which we procure these wood products, and how far things have to move and how much energy is consumed in making the products that we apply to our buildings. And we got really interested in this question of industry, and we started looking at the way industry makes things. And so we went to, in the case of these series of bridges that I'll show, we went to glue laminators, timber glue laminators, and we started to look at what their processes were, which are fairly obvious, and what their maximum potential was, and how to essentially move material from industry by teasing out these tight configurations of production to make architecture out of it. Really simple architecture, but architecture that was really trying to assess industrial process, because that was really how we thought of our own work initially when we were working on cabinets, but now we were bringing it up to the architectural scale. And of course, this is really interesting because these are, essentially the remaking of beams of trees into new forms using, right now, adhesives, but a whole host of other kinds of mechanical lamination techniques, and then applying them out in the landscape. And in our case, mostly these kind of remote forest landscapes where we were building things like suspension bridges and remote valleys, and trying to figure out exactly how to move the material there and make sure that they were stable, and all the other problems that we run into as we try to build out in the world. And as Frank Lloyd Wright once said, put our buildings out in the rain. And that has developed now into a more recent series of projects that are now, sort of infrastructural scale, not just sort of pedestrian or small vehicular bridges. We're working with Fast and Ep in British Columbia, Vancouver, to make a bridge along the Hudson River to cross a Metro North railway track as part of a 9-mile trail that's being designed by Scape landscape architects. And the bridge is a combination of glulam planks over a steel hull, that's sort of ship-shaped arch, ship hull-shaped arch, series of arches. And this was a dogfight to get all the different agencies that have jurisdiction over this particular site along the Hudson River to agree to using timber. And that's been really the story of our work all along, convincing the city of New York to allow us to use timber to build a small grandstand for a regional championship Little League field in Staten Island, where we were told that we should use steel because it's a coastal environment and steel's safer than wood, which struck me as kind of idiotic. But you can't say that to the head of the Design Excellence Commission at the New York City Department of Buildings. And we also used it, started to bring these projects, kinds of wood projects into, or mass timber projects into small cities in our area. This is a carousel pavilion and event space in Stamford, Connecticut, just a one-story kind of shed. But we used, really kind of cutting-edge digital techniques, modeling techniques, and programming to produce this 40-foot cupola with 3 skylights in it right over the carousel. And then also to bring timber into our city. And the way we argued it was, we're in New Haven, which is a 19th century industrial city, and there are a lot of relatively low-rise 3-4 story unreinforced masonry buildings. And what we were able to say is we can create more density in your land-starved city by adding stories to existing historic structures without destroying those structures. And we're going to use these massive, very stiff but light systems. And we found that actually now in our third project, that by adding these materials to the tops of buildings, we actually use these stiff structures to reinforce unreinforced masonry buildings. So there's this kind of like, again, a synergy between this historic structure and fabric and these new systems, which we're using to create very simple housing. And then we've also worked on schools. This is a school we did about 6 years ago, Common Ground High School, one of the first schools to use cross-laminated timber and these massive timber systems to produce the spaces that the students would live in, work in, spend most of their life in during their high school years. And it was assembled incredibly quickly, prefabricated entirely, fully insulated wall panels over a structural mass timber frame, and assembled in 5 weeks by 4 carpenters on a small mobile crane. A fairly complex form, because I'm an architect and I like shape making too, like everybody else. And interestingly enough, to pour the concrete foundations, which were actually a frost slab, so a 4-foot stem wall around the perimeter of the building, and the slabs took 6 times that to get through the excavation and the pouring of the concrete. So the building is essentially a sort of suite of these different mass timber products. It just left as a sort of industrial finish in the primary spaces and classrooms. And the students seem to like it a lot, and they tell us that the building smells good, which I think is a great new architectural criterion. And I tell everybody that. You've probably heard it before if you've ever heard me talk about it. What the students know also is they know really the provenance of this material. They know what forests in Quebec this black spruce is harvested. Am I? Sorry. Okay. But they can't tell you where the gypsum in the wall panels, interior areas, which are covered in gypsum board for fire resistance reasons, where that gypsum was mined. And I think that's a big question that we have to ask ourselves as well, which is, how remote are we from the processes that we engage and incur? And what are the consequences of those processes that we're incurring when we build buildings or eat food or drive a car? And unfortunately, advanced capitalism has allowed us to be ignorant of that. And so part of the process that I'd like to talk about a little more is this re-entangling ourselves with natural systems and natural landscapes, and doing it in a really productive way. So the Common Ground School has led to a lot of other projects. We're currently making a 70-unit housing project in New Haven, Connecticut for a historically Black community, 70 units of housing in a very housing deprived area of our city, built entirely not only out of mass timber, but fully biological, bio-based insulations, bio-based modified wood for the cladding. All the demising walls are cross-laminated timber. The base structure at the ground level, the commercial spaces and community spaces are also made out of glulam, not concrete. So we really worked hard on this project. It has gotten its low-income tax credit. It will break ground, despite the fact that we saw a tripling of wood prices in the time that we first bid it for our low-income tax credit application and the time that we were granted it. We've still got it happening. So there are a lot of forces at work. And so this has brought me a bit to some more of this work on Timber City and this question that we're working on for the U.S. Forest Service right now, which is, how do you actually bring this wood systems that's so wood production systems that are so geared to creating suburban morphologies and low-rise building into cities like New Haven, New York, Boston, Austin. We've seen experiments in the Pacific Northwest and increasingly in the Southeast, but the Northeastern wood basket is huge, and we're not using timber in these ways, except in these small, more experimental projects that I've talked about. And so we're looking really at how to take the species that are coming out of forests, not cut for, out of plantation forests or single species monocultural forests, but rather really rich, diverse kinds of forests that exist in our region. Mixed hardwoods, some different spruces and pines, and how do we apply those throughout the building envelope and structure. And meantime, what we did is looked at two landscapes, a working forest in Maine, a district in my city in New Haven, and we essentially studied very carefully in these particular forests how long it would take for these forests to grow, what the initiation of the different stand conditions would entail, what kind of biodiversity existed within those different stands types, and then also how quickly it would take to regrow. And essentially, alongside, we modeled our urban forest, which was a series of prototypical buildings, 7 stories tall, with a number of units and cores and structure, engineered them and measured how much carbon was in them. And I'll go through this quickly, but basically what we found was, we take 60 forest plots over 60 years, and we use 45 of them rotationally for sort of a mosaic harvest that brings a lot of wood into the city to build around 22 buildings in 4-block area, which were former parking lots. And we looked at the math. About 114,000 metric tons of carbon preserved in the forest because we didn't tear up the soils. We let it, and we left 25% in reserve for existing wildlife habitat. Then we looked at how much was reabsorbed through the growth of the plots that we'd harvested, 51,000 metric tons. Then in the city, we stored 34,000 tons of that. So there's some losses. And then most importantly, what we didn't build out of steel and concrete avoided 83,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. So that's 280 roughly thousand metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's a lot, sort of. 63,000 vehicles worth. We're pretty familiar with this metric. How many vehicles do you take off the road when you store carbon? From a standpoint of finance, $30 per metric ton is about what you get if you have to pay for polluting. You have to pay about $30 a metric ton to emit carbon dioxide in regional greenhouse gas initiatives, RGGI in the Northeast, Air Resources Board in California. And for those 22 buildings, that's worth $8.5 million, which, in the pocket of a developer would be a nice chunk of change. A city authority with jurisdiction might like using that for supporting its tax base. But if you look at the kinds of projections that are expected from environmental economists like Bill Nordhaus at Yale, in over the next 3 decades, that's going to quadruple in value, or cost, this waste material cost. And by the end of, it's expected that by 2100, it could be up to $1,000 a ton that will be the cost of emitting carbon dioxide. And so if we can put that back in the pockets of builders, we can help to support a new economy. So I shifted up in scale again, but I do want to talk a little bit about teaching, because this has been a big part of my students and my colleagues have helped, like Uli, have helped me really think a lot about how we can introduce these techniques into a next generation of people who will be specifying buildings, designing buildings, engineering buildings, and actually building buildings, so that they can become experts in this new bio-building economy. And I worked for, as Michelle knows, I worked for a number of years running the Yale Building Project with colleague Adam Hoffner, and that was a sort of design build program that in the recent years, working with Dean Deborah Burke, we were able to transform significantly by making housing for homeless families. And so every year we build a house for a couple of homeless families who live in these duplex buildings. The students build pretty much everything except for the licensed trade requirements, electricity, plumbing. A lot of this is prefabricated. And, really we've been able to build quite a number of houses in inner city New Haven to meet the needs of families who are essentially disenfranchised from the housing market, business as usual housing market. And, I think what the students learn is not only how to build and the experience of making their designs real, but they also deal with the real constraints that exist in a city like New Haven with strict regulatory requirements. And they also can use these building projects as a kind of platform for investigating any aspect of the building they want. So some of the students were doing life cycle assessments, studying carbon impact. Some were studying material waste. Others were studying financing supportive housing in cities and in Connecticut. And other people were doing sociological surveys of how people felt in New Haven about the buildings that the students built. And some hated them and some loved them, as you might suspect. But the most meaningful thing about it is that the students were actually seeing their work produce a home for families who've been utterly disenfranchised. And I think that's been probably one of the most rewarding things. And I'm also proud of some of the buildings that were built. They're really beautiful architecturally. About 3 years ago, I went to Deborah Burke, our dean, and I said, Deborah, I can't do this anymore. It's been amazing, but I've sort of reached my peak. And she asked me very kindly not to leave, which was I was grateful for, but to start a lab, which we were calling the Yale Regenerative Building Lab. And our first project was a joint project with the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History and the Yale Center for Biospheric Studies that needed a coastal research station on a remote island off the coast of Connecticut in Long Island Sound. And these are very, very undeveloped. This is a very undeveloped island in a rather suburban developed island chain. And we took our most advanced students, third-year graduate students in environmental science and also in architecture, and we essentially built a circular economic building, recovering CLT from the fire safety tests at Beltsville, Maryland, at the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms safety lab. We shipped them up to our workspace. We prefabricated the entire building, built the whole thing once inside the building and sections outside the building, and then dismantled it for shipping, which we loaded onto a rocky outcrop, which is, I'm driving that forklift, and I can tell you it's about the worst loading dock I've ever used in my life, but we did call it a loading dock, and we moved these panels and reassembled the building on site. And part of that was going on into the forests of Horse Island, the island on which we were working in, and looking with foresters at these very degraded vinelands that these forests had become, and to think of ways not to take the best trees out of the forest, but actually the worst ones, and how to use them to create the structure of the building. And it was a great exercise because what we learned was no real lessons on how to solve the housing crisis for 2.3 billion urban dwellers, but we did learn some of the resources that exist close at hand that can be used if we think a little more imaginatively about how we're going to build in the future. And this is a particularly bespoke project, no question, but we were using hemlock cut from the Yale forests that were dying of a disease called woolly adelgid. And so they were harvesting those. So they had a bunch of hemlock, and we were finding different ways to use them for structure and finishes and things like that, to produce this sort of open pavilion with big sliding doors that close up for classroom use on an island that's only accessible by a 20-minute ferry ride. And that finally culminated for us in this project that Uli mentioned, which is the ecological building module, the ELM that we built with the Center for Ecosystems and Architecture at Yale. And Organschi, my firm, did all the design of the building and the prefabrication, worked really closely with the engineers who were developing the environmental control systems, which sought to meet every one of the UN Habitat and UN Environment's sustainability goals. To consider exactly the sourcing of material, how much carbon could be stored and how much would be lost through emissions, how to actually create a series of systems that were integrated and synergistically operating to not only grow plant materials on walls, which is actually not, I would say, not a terribly efficient system of agriculture, but mostly to create systems that would provide safe, secure housing for up to 4 people in a peri-urban site where there might be food, water, physical insecurity, and how to create systems that would provide passive ventilation, water absorbed through condensation of water vapor in the air, potable water, energy systems using these systems that were developed by Center for Ecosystems and Architecture, very efficient solar PV skylights. The story goes on and on. And what we did was we had 8 weeks to build this thing, and we had 2 days to put it into the UN security perimeter at the UN Plaza in New York, which I can tell you is like, imagine bringing a building through airport security every day. It was not fun, and they didn't like us until we finished it. And then everyone loved it, because one of the things that we also know as architects is when you finally build the building and you do it pretty well, people really appreciate the lessons that building can teach. And so I remain committed to this idea that we can change the world through our experimentation as long as we scientifically substantiate our claims rather than just make claims. And that's something I really wanted to work on. And the other thing I want to say about this last project that I'm showing is this idea that all of these people arrayed to make this little building were everybody that touched the design, the construction, the systems engineering, the logistics. Everybody here represents a huge group of people who are collaborating, and to remember that architecture is a highly collaborative undertaking. And not only do we specify huge volumes of material, making us by far the largest consumers or agents of consumption of anyone in the world, but we also entail huge teams of workers on this thing, and that we have also a way to make our experience of work and an enterprise positive and healthy. And that's the thing I want to bring. It's not just about carbon and biodiversity and energy savings. It's about re-enfranchising huge communities with real opportunity for enterprise, communities that have been historically disenfranchised by, I use this word over and over again, I'm sorry, but basically stripped of their ability to employ the knowledge that they have. And we have to remember that research is a basic human right. It's not something that only happens in universities. So I'll close in the remaining minutes with just this final chapter, which is this idea of that through this creative, inventive, highly collaborative effort, we can potentially transform the global building sector to be certainly less of a agent of climate change, and potentially even to serve to reverse it. And so John Schellenhuber, the climate physicist, got together with me and a few other people who are in research and design and engineering, and we decided to start up this new Bauhaus movement called Bauhaus der Erde, or Bauhaus Earth, which would essentially convene all of the amazing research that was going on in the world, but few people understood it, and create this sort of force, this nexus of experimentation and assessment, two very important keys in this thing. And John likes to describe the sort of crisis of represented by the Charter of Athens, in which a bunch of famous modernist architects and thinkers got together and essentially tried to distill all the systems that existed societally to produce cities and disentangle them from each other and from nature. And John likes to say, what we really need to do is re-entangle ourselves in a productive and deeply understanding way. And so the modes of this re-entanglement are, of course, research, implementation, demonstration, education, all happening simultaneously and hopefully in a coordinated way. The ecosystem of this system that we built includes a think tank, a sort of pedagogical program for teaching advanced students, and my innovation lab, which is essentially pulling together work from around the world, a series of X-Lab partners doing deep demonstration projects and exhibiting their work at different scales, from small buildings up to urban districts. And so we're engaged in a whole host of different kinds of methods of touching material, processing it, trying to understand it, not eschewing big industrial processes, but also really trying to look closely at historic and traditional cultural practices. And our work is inevitably transscalar. We're looking, as my friend Kilmo would say, from the molecular to the territorial. We're trying to think across these spaces. We must work globally. I am in the heart of Europe, in Berlin, but I will tell you that I am not that worried about Europe. It's the rest of the world which is seeking to grow and reach the standards of living that the more advanced economies in the world have already reached, and may endanger us and themselves by replicating our poor behaviors. It's very important. This collection of workers are working in a science-based design program. The idea that a new set of criteria in the old triad of materials, means, and methods would include impact, and that we have to understand those impacts. And of course, it's interdisciplinary. Well, we're climate physicists, urban systems modelers, we're artists and architects and engineers and manufacturers and financiers and policymakers. And it's an amazing consortium. And we work collaboratively, amazingly, in the same room. We sit down all together and do this work, and sometimes in the factory. And we talk to people across the sector. So mobility services, cancer research, and we're really learning a lot from their knowledge base as soon as we learn to speak each other's languages. And of course, I want this work to be inventive and beautiful and exciting, because I think it's a very promising, but that tool of making cool forms is no longer serving us. And in fact, it's creating incredible complexity and cost in terms of climate impacts. And we want to be specific about our work, the work in these different places that we engage. And so my lab is essentially in the process of developing relationships with lab partners around the world, so-called X labs. And our in-lab in Berlin is in an old gas plant where we have a workshop, but we also convene meetings with all these different people. This is actually copied from a photograph that I took when my partner in my studio at Yale on timber in 2014 provoked Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack to visit us. And there's Michelle Addington, who was our real champion and kindly joined us to meet the secretary, who stayed for about 2 hours talking to us about all the possibilities of building with wood. That's this guy from a corn growing state. And then we have X Labs, which are essentially a series of partnerships that are starting to grow. So in Senegal, we're working with people who are doing unreinforced, unfired brick to produce multi-story buildings. And we're developing a lab program there. We're looking at working with the IAAC, EOC, and the lab in Catalonia, which is looking at forests of Catalonia and how we can produce buildings using those forest products, but also circular economic flows of material from waste streams, like this glass that was part of a Zaha Hadid building, but it was overage. We're in Indonesia looking at bamboo as a building material for mass bamboo multi-story buildings. But what it entails is the entire system of production, which includes land grants and reforms that allow small communes to harvest material, cut and process it, ship that material to shared cooperative factories, make the mass timber, and then send it out into the market. And so the 1,000 Bamboo Villages program has signed on with us, and our colleagues, Arif and Rezal, are working with us to share information. And we have new programs that are developing around industrial corridors with Ana Maria Duran Calisto, who is running a restoration lab along the industrial corridors of the Ecuadorian Amazon, and trying to develop actually a bioeconomy, not just focused on building, but also the different materials that will can produce new kinds of products within a regenerative and sustainable forest management program and restoration program. And our themes are what you'd expect: life cycle impact reduction, economic circular economy, regenerative restorative supply, carbon econometrics. How do you actually monetize carbon to make it incentive to build with it? How to substitute materials that are made biologically, because that's a real challenge that we face. And how do we use ecosystem services of forest landscapes rather than trying to replicate them with mechanical systems? And then, as I mentioned, there exists in the building supply chain not just hardship, but actually human slavery exists within the building. Some of the products that are manufactured may entail human slavery. So how do we switch that so that this revolution can restore societal benefit, socioeconomic access to resources? And so we have our series of steps, and it starts with trying to stop climate change, but through that, build a system of kind of systemic benefit through the act of building, and to look at that across scales, from material units to landscapes. And really what we're describing essentially is a kind of reversal of history. It's a really grand scheme, but 350 million years of slow absorption of carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, through plant growth, the deposition of that carbon into soils, and through compaction and high temperature, the production of fossil hydrocarbons. That 350 million years was essentially undone in 170, the Industrial Revolution, where all of that was dug up, and the fugitive carbon produced enormous challenges in our environment, which we're seeing manifested through a host of weather conditions and environmental impacts, sea level rise. So what would happen if in the future, from this day, if we could somehow move forward with drawing down the carbon impacts that we've created through the synergistic relationships that I mentioned before between natural forest growth and city building. So I'll close. This is a project that we did about 12, 13 years ago, a landscape of building material spread across a formerly productive forest, and to turn that into a kind of building and to use it as a way to make building form and finish. It's really a metaphor. It's not a truly circular economic building. It's a storage building for materials. But in some senses, I think what we were trying to do was tell a little story about tidying up the mess that we'd made, and to try to make something strong out of that, rather than just have it be a task, a burden. So I'll end there and just suggest that we have a kind of new manifesto in our hands, ready to think about how buildings not only can solve the housing crisis, but in the process create systemic benefit for all mankind, humankind, and hopefully do it really fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for this really wonderful talk. And I mean, I've obviously seen some of your work before, but it's always refreshing to see how you package things, and also the new things that you've done that I've just learned about. And I really appreciate the breadth of the work that you've engaged in over the years of your career. It's very, very inspiring. So I don't know I know we're at the half hour, but if you're available for a few questions, if there's any questions in the audience, anyone on Zoom, you can also put it in the chat, or you can put it in the YouTube chat as well. Are there any questions for Alan? If not,
I think I wore everybody out, Oli.
You what? I
wore everybody out.
Well, the very aspirational projects that you're working on. So so maybe I'm gonna ask a question about kind of personally where you see yourself going. Like, is there a kind of a limit to your tenure at Bauhaus Earth, or what are your plans? I know you've only been there for a year, so it's maybe a little premature to say, but I'd like to learn more about what you're thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I have with my partner Lisa Gray, who's pulling the heavy burden of keeping our practice running while I gallivant around and get to talk to people at the EC and all over the world. And it's a high class problem to have, I guess, because I feel very lucky to be able to work with the people I'm getting to work with. I'm saying this honestly, losing Michelle at Yale was one of the reasons I wanted to go away. So, because it was such a wonderful collaboration to work with a person who was really looking at the deep scientific implications of what we do. And I'm signed on officially for 2 years. My partners are telling me, it's not going to end. It's started slow, and it's accelerated. We have 25 million euros of funding for the next 4 years, and more coming in. Projects in Bhutan, reskilling the entire workforce to shift it from a concrete-based building economy to a bio-based economy. The groups that I've mentioned that we're already teaming up with, and others kind of in the pipeline. And frankly, I would love to include UT School of Architecture and Engineering along with that, if that were of interest to anyone. So please let me know. I think we have a lot of places to touch down in to try to understand how much incredible knowledge exists in those places about the very specific resource pools, socioeconomic conditions and constraints, political challenges, to make this transformation happen. And there's a lot of knowledge out there. And I think the one failing of our discipline is that we haven't gathered anything about the real substance of what those innovations are, and mostly just take pictures of it and put them in architectural magazines. And again, I'm an architect and I love cool looking buildings, but I often look at them and wonder, like, what does that really entail? So to answer your question, maybe in a long-winded way, Uli, I think right now it's a 5-year plan, but it's a 10-year roadmap, and it's a 30-year implementation process. So if my partner doesn't kill me, I'll try to balance these two things for at least another decade. That's the goal.
Thank you, Alan. I see Michelle has a question for you, Alan.
First of all, give Lisa my best.
I will, thank you.
And I'm sure you know that I fell in love with your work very early on when I saw that beautiful shed and the way that materials were curated within that shed, and that's what got me paying attention to the things that you do. But I'm going to ask a tough question. Yeah. We've seen a lot of heroic solutions to climate change. Particularly when they're analyzed at this particular scale, and they're applied to what our future building might be, whether it's a future building that's done, anew, or whether it's future building that might be in terms of renovation. But scaling it up to make a difference requires, let's just say, a universal adoption and adaptation to this. And I think one of the reasons that I actually came here to the University of Texas was to actually put myself in the world where, particularly sort of getting involved with local government, but also we have a very extensive relationship in Latin America, particularly with Mexico, beginning to sort of understand what all of those other influences might be, and that it ends up being not sort of just thinking in terms of adoption or adaptation, but all of the moments at which there are things that just say stoppers along the way, and a lot of it ends up being economic, by the way. I think about, work I did many years ago in Cairo for the Ministry of Housing there. And they wanted to build 60 million homes outside of Cairo in the desert. And they actually called it Reclaiming the Desert for housing. And of course, they were all going to be concrete. And they're dealing with issues that many of us, particularly those of us in this country, and those of us who've come from elite institutions, and I'm including UT as an elite institution, can't even begin to sort of like fathom how those decisions are being made. And so I'm wondering if your group is also thinking about where do you can most strategically make this happen? What is where can the switch be turned so that you know you can get a foothold in certain places. Because the question of widespread adoption, we're not even close to sort of thinking how that would happen, but we could begin to strategically put down a footprint, get a foothold of beginning to demonstrate what some of these practices might be and what the potential might be and what its impact might be.
I mean, that's not just a hard question, that's the essential question, which is the systemic resistance that exists to make any changes. I mean, we already know that the building sector is enormously slow to any kind of change, but there have been historical moments of significant change driven economically and because of certain kinds of demands and constraints. And the revolution in steel and concrete is an example of that. And these industries scaled rapidly, and we did a sort of literature review of the speed at which the adoption of steel and the expansion of steel production happened at the big turn of the century. We looked at it with aluminum, we looked at it with concrete. So we've seen these sort of spurts that are transformational, and because everyone is looking over their shoulder and trying to adopt new approaches, that is a source of hope, right? But that, as you say, Michelle, is lodged within a rather narrow slice of decision making, which is the making, design of buildings and the production of building products. So one of the things with the Bauhaus is exactly that. We're trying to work with people who are writing policy, funding instruments for these kinds of changes, and doing it in different countries. I mentioned Bhutan. I'm right now working with the King of Bhutan's Royal Commission on the transformation of the building sector to develop an educational program within the sort of professional class of design and engineering, and then also among the building sector. And it is a tiny country with significant forests protected since 1980 with a UN project. We're looking at South Africa, Cape Town, a lab there with Edgar Pieterse, who's a social scientist, and a team who are looking at non-crete, which is a super low Portland cement concrete, which has better carbon sequestration improvements. A forest program in Gabon. I mentioned the industrial corridors in Ecuador, and we're trying to touch down in these places, and there are many more where we think that we can create a little bit of a shock to the system. Ecuador is a great example of what you say, which is that the government has essentially mandated that indigenous communities use agriculture as an economic livelihood, and it's failed these communities entirely, and the forests have been degraded, and their cultural knowledge has been completely neglected. And meanwhile, extractive industries in lithium and for car batteries, and oil palm for food products, and plywood, everything has kind of continued its march. So the questions are deep and they are systemic, and that's why I think the team of scientists, these leading scientists who we're looking at climate change early on, and we're building models of how atmospheric systems would transform our experience of the landscape and weather and things like that, and predicting these things. But we're also generating policy. I spent a week at the European community in Brussels talking to a bunch of people who fund Horizon Europe, which is a $98 billion sustainability program. And they were asking us essentially, how do we spend this money to make sure that it's most effective? Whether that does anything, I don't know, but I'm seeing a kind of a groundswell, first by the demands of our population to be careful about the way we use resources, particularly the sort of next generation of adults who are going to move in and have to solve the problems that we create. A lot of interest in these new products. It feels kind of like a paradigm shift in construction. The question is, how do we marshal all of that into a kind of movement? And I don't have the answer for that, but it's kind of my last shot, I think, to try to do it. And working with people like you and with institutions like UT to try to coalesce a kind of meaningful answer that's responsive to very specific global regions, not just a general universal ham-fisted response. But it's a gargantuan task. And if you are timid, there's at all, there's no way we're going to answer it. But it's terrible to watch what's happening in Ukraine as just one of many examples, and we've perpetrated some of this stuff ourselves, but not in this quite the same way. This is a sort of active extractivism. It's related to digging up materials out of the ground. It's related to enslaving people. It's basically trying to pull the greatest possible economic and political benefit out of an act of destruction. So when you see that, you're thinking like, God, how can we solve climate change? And the answer is maybe we can't, but it's our last shot. And I think that's the only quite pathetic answer that I can give to your excellent question.
Thank you for this. And I'll float out there that, our field is small. If you think about how many there are, and if each school or each team is working on their own, we're better when we all work together on this. And there's different complementary aspects that each school can bring into play. I mean, Yale's fortunate that you all have the great partners with forestry and environmental studies. We're fortunate for having not only our sort of amazing relationships in Latin America, but also some serious boots on the ground, because we do engage with policy and the policymakers on a regular basis. And we can start to look at schools throughout, as well as schools within the world. We each bring something to the table. And so I'm all for thinking about this as a larger collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I will say that in addition to having some everyday trepidation about the scale of what we're trying to take on, I also think we could be successful and really screw it up. So we're sort of like stuck a little bit, like what if this new bioeconomy just becomes one more extractive system that wipes out huge landscapes of valuable forest? That's what a lot of people are worried about. We're trying to substantiate these claims that we're making based on these research, working with people like forest land policy people and land managers. But like we don't control the forces who could cut down Siberian forests, for example, right? So we need to be very careful as well as very aggressive.
David, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Alan, first of all, I just have a very quick question. I just wanted to thank you because I'm getting emails flooding into my inbox. Great talk, great talk, great talk, great talk. So I just wanted to say thanks. My question is just a permission question. I'd like to share this lecture, the tape of it, with students from the engineering school with some faculty there. And I just wanted your permission to do that because this is just a great talk. It's super broad, super spectacular. I have my own interest. I'm going to write you because I'm doing some projects in Ecuador right now as well. And,
great, excellent.
Yeah, super interesting. And we're up against this kind of cultural wall of concrete down there, and the kind of desire to kind of insistence on the use of concrete. But I just wanted to say thank you and ask your permission to share the lecture.
Yeah, by all means. And I can actually even share the slides. Let me just run through really quickly, David, and make sure that I have all the attributions correct so I don't, perpetrate intellectual property violations.
We'll look the other way. Hey, thank you so much. I've got to kick up. I just want to say thanks. I'll be in touch and really the lecture. Just great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Really appreciate it. And yes, please do reach out to us if if there's any opportunities for collaboration.
You're high
and thank you. Yeah, and I was looking forward to sitting down with you over a cup of coffee, which the last thing we probably want to do is have a virtual cup of coffee, but hopefully we can get together in person soon and catch up, because I also have a lot of questions for you that there's no time to.
And really, Michelle, do send your excellent students, if they can stand moving up to the Northeast, send them our way, because Organschi is looking for the kinds of people that you produce. So,
we will. Thank you so much, Alan.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Michelle.
Take care.